Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone may be seated, please. I hope parking was a little easier for you this morning. I'm glad that worked out. And Miss Barbara will be getting with you this morning to get your lunch orders. I'll ask the state to call the first witness, please.
We will call Larry Peterson. That's your name.
You'll face me and raise your right hand, please. You solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the trial of this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Thank you. You'll have a seat here, please. If you would, state your name for the record.
Larry Keith Peterson.
And Mr. Peterson, if you will, tell the jury a little bit about your training and experience.
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science in Forensic Science from the University of Central Florida. Retired with 30 years experience with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation State Crime Laboratory, primarily working in the areas of trace evidence or what could be called criminalistics as well. And during that time, trained under Drs. Ken Szynski and Jim Howard at the State Crime Laboratory. I've taken numerous classes and seminars on the analysis of physical evidence. Since retiring from the GBI Crime Laboratory, I spent almost 9 years with the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory here in Fort Gillem, doing trace evidence as well.
And have you ever had the occasion to go to a crime scene and then analyze a crime scene?
Yes, we were on call for crime scenes as well.
Okay. How many crime scenes in your career would you say that you have had to evaluate or analyze?
It was not our primary duty, but I would say over 50.
Your Honor, at this time I will tender Mr. Peterson as an expert in this field of being a microanalyst and crime scene analysis.
Any objection to him giving opinions in those fields?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, so recognized.
Did you go to a crime scene back on October 9th of 1983 where the body of a young black male had been discovered?
Yes, I was on call that weekend and responded to Spalding County.
Okay. And at that time, the body had not been identified?
Correct.
Okay. So you were there to do what?
Primarily, I was there to collect evidence. GBI investigative agents were there at the scene primarily to do the overall crime scene analysis. So my primary duty from the laboratory was to collect evidence. As part of that, I did make a rough crime scene sketch to help me relate some of the physical items of evidence that I was collecting.
Okay. And Agent Robertson was primary on the scene, is that right?
That's correct.
And he is now deceased?
My understanding, yes.
Okay. But he did a sketch of the crime scene as well, is that correct?
Yes.
Right. And have you had an opportunity to compare your notes and your sketches of the crime scene with his?
Yes, they roughly correlate, although my rough sketch, I think, has more detail in terms of some of the actual physical items of evidence that I was collecting, not so much on the distances and the exact positioning of the victim's body to other points of reference at the scene. So my rough sketch was more the actual items of evidence and how they related roughly to one another as opposed to exact distances and spacings of how they are related to one another to Mentor Road or other items at the scene.
Okay. And I'm going to show you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 10 and State's Exhibit 11. And I'm going to ask you if you recognize those.
Yes, I do. So State's Exhibit 10 and 11 are a facsimile, I will say, of my original drawing. So back at the laboratory during a paperwork reduction period of time back in the mid-90s, all the original drawings and material were scanned into a record, and so this is a print from that scanned image. So unfortunately, it loses a lot of detail in that process.
Fair to say that's been a source of frustration for you in evaluating your own notes?
It has.
Okay. Did you also, I know we have the photographs from Agent Robertson, but did you also take photographs?
Yes, I photographed the scene, including tire impressions and overall victim's body and different evidence items that were there. Unfortunately, in contacting the laboratory, they were unable to produce the actual photographs that I took back in 1983.
So they were gone?
Apparently.
Okay. Let's start with the scene. And And Judge, I'm sorry, Your Honor, may I grab I tender 10 and 11? Okay, I'll tender 10 and 11 at this time.
They're admitted?
Thank you. May I publish?
Yes, ma'am.
State's Exhibit 11. And may he step down, Judge, so he can interpret?
Yes, just speak up for the court reporter.
What is the jury looking at here?
This is Minter Road, a dirt roadway. And then some of these items are just relating. There was a tree and like a dirt pathway that went around the tree. There was another kind of a pathway, not a road, but a pathway that went across the tree up into kind of a field of low overgrown brush. So there were a number of cartridge casings in the middle of the road. There is, to the left of the pathway, tire impressions, part of which were plastic acid. There were 2 blood stains adjacent to that. In the middle of the pathway was a shirt that I subsequently described as a sweater, right on the edge of Minter, right where the pathway went. I'm not sure that it actually went upward towards another area where an apparent struggle had taken place. And then in relation, there was a telephone pole over here, which was used to just try to roughly correlate the scene.
Okay, so you mentioned some blood stains and the sweater. Were you able to determine if a struggle likely occurred there at that point?
Well, it would appear so based on the blood stains in 2 different locations near the tire marks.
Okay. And as we go, I'm going to show you the pictures to try to point.
Also, can I point out that there was apparent blood stains on the shirt, whatever, so it seemed like it would be direct relation to the actual crime.
Okay. I'm going to, you might have a seat while you look at them if you want to. I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibits and previously given to Defense Counsel as State's Exhibits 14 through 30. And I'll ask if you recognize those.
Yes, these all appear to be images taken from the crime scene, including the victim's body and the area surrounding it.
And are they true and accurate depictions of the crime scene back in 1983?
To the best of my recollection, they do. Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, at this point, I will tender State's Exhibits 14 through 30. Permission to publish?
They're admitted?
And may I publish, Judge?
Yes.
You mentioned a roadway, the shirts, tire tracks. And you might have to step down again. Do you have leave just to step down and go to Judge?
Yes, ma'am.
Is this one of the dirt roads that you were referring to?
Right. This would have been Minter Road at the top and a tree that's in the drawing that's a reference point. And then this would have been the dirt roadway where the victim's body was found.
Okay. State's Exhibit 15.
Okay, this exhibit is depicting some of the tire impressions as well as what I described as a shirt or possibly a sweater that had some blood staining on it that was recovered from where the pathway entered into the other pathway where they diverged.
Okay. We were speaking a moment ago about Steve Robertson's sketches, I'm going to show you what has been marked and previously given to defense counsel as States Exhibits 12 and 13. Do you recognize those?
Yes, that is his drawing of
Okay.
the scene.
And is it fair and accurate after reviewing your notes and the photos?
Yes, it generally relates to the positions that I had drawn as well.
Okay. Your Honor, I will tender States Exhibits 12 and 13.
They're admitted.
And Your Honor, I have demonstratives. We've simply blown up the Mr. Robertson's maps, and I've labeled them 31 and 32 and have shown them to defense counsel. May we tender them as a demonstrative aid?
Yes.
So, on this diagram here, maybe we should where is the shirt found?
The shirt would have been found on Minter Road. This would be Minter Road, this would be the tree, Minter Road. So the shirt would have been located near that area right there. And there's a pathway, a rough kind of a trail depicted there.
Your State's Exhibit 10, which is your depiction of the crime scene here, that's lower, I guess, or farther into the field. Is that fair to say?
Yes, so this would be kind of a pathway as opposed to a road. Minter Road is down here at the bottom, so the shirt would have been near the tire impressions, roughly, here's the tree, would have been roughly right where this trail extended from Minter Road.
Okay. And what do you note in the middle there of the exhibit, this here?
The middle area is in an area of apparent struggle. A lot of the grass area, whatever low, had been kind of pressed down in an area, and in the middle of that, there was a fairly large blood stain. There were some blue yarns or threads, as well as several pieces of like a broken apparent club. It was kind of carved like maybe it could have been a leg to a chair or a table or something. It had some tape at one end and was broken in two main pieces and then a couple of smaller pieces. So there's like four pieces, two main broken pieces that were still kind of attached.
So would you qualify that as a separate area of struggle from the first that we discussed earlier?
Yes, this was clearly a struggle area. And then there was apparent drag marks extending from that area that went down toward the position where there was some cut dead limbs to a pine tree, and the victim's body was near that pathway, near the downed cut pine limbs.
And Agent Robertson also notes drag marks on his diagram.
He does.
And where does he note those drag marks?
These drag marks are, I believe, number 7, which would have been roughly marked as 100 feet from the victim to the struggle area.
Okay. And he also notes drag marks here in this area.
Correct.
And what is that measurement there?
Roughly, here's marked 64 feet 9 inches.
He also notes, what is his number 4?
His number 4 is blood-like stains.
Okay, and where does he note those?
Right in the struggle area.
Okay, and does he also note them in other places?
Yes, there's another blood stain marked towards this kind of dirt trail in 2 different locations. One behind the victim, near where the cut down pine cuttings would have been, as well as one approximately 118 feet along the dirt trail as well.
Okay. And he notes what is his number 5? I'm sorry. I don't want to please.
A rock with blood-like stains.
Okay. And where does he note that?
He notes that, just get the direction. This would be south, since north is to the bottom, approximately south, 64 feet south of the blood stain.
Okay. And he notes the body resting where?
Along the dirt trail, near where the pine cuttings one, so that would have been the dirt trail in the photograph
Okay.
that we discussed earlier.
Well, was there a power line here? Did a power line run along here?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the power line has a utility pole marked not far from Mentor Road.
Okay. And so the power line would have gone, I guess, his direction is north this way?
I'm not sure the direction, there's marking a distance. I'm not sure the direction of the power lines. So it's like approximately 434 feet from the victim's body to the power line.
Okay. Let's go back to your diagram. And I might need to zoom in a little bit. You think that might help? If I zoom in a bit, then?
Maybe, I don't know.
You also noted drag marks on your diagram, right?
Correct.
Okay, where did you note those?
These kind of wavy lines here from the victim's body to this area of apparent struggle, I had identified as apparent drag marks.
All right. Did you note drag marks anywhere else?
Yes, over to my right, there is another area of tire markings that I have marked as 12 on my drawing. It's tire markings. Then an area of drag markings, appear to be drag markings, going towards the dirt roadway that eventually led to where the victim's body was. And there was another down tree, generally in that location. The drag markings appear to go from in that tree location across the roadway pathway up to an area where there was a rock with a blood stain, as well as a hole that it appeared that a rock would have come out, that the rock could have come out from.
Okay. And that rock did have blood stains on it?
It did.
Okay. So it appears that you have several drag marks. Would you have called it a pattern, perhaps?
Yes, it'd be a pattern, sure.
Okay. Could it be consistent with a body being drugged?
Yes.
Okay. Could it be consistent with a body being drugged behind a car or a truck?
Could be, sure.
Okay. You mentioned an area of struggle noted both on your diagram and on Agent Robertson's diagram. I'm noting this area here. And you indicated that on your diagram there was a sign of a struggle, there was a club, and areas of blood.
Correct.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 17. Is that the club that you're referring to?
It is.
Okay. And State's Exhibit 18.
That would also be the club as well.
State's Exhibit 16. Tell the jury what they're looking at here.
There's an area of blood staining in here. I'm not exactly sure since there were several areas of blood staining. But there's a lot of pine here, so potentially this could be the blood stain that was behind the victim, behind the downed cut pine cuttings.
State's Exhibit 19.
This is another area of blood staining in soil that was next to a tire impression, so I think this would likely have been near the scene of Mentor Road,
Okay.
where one of the pathways went off Mentor Road.
State's Exhibit 20.
It's an apparent tire impression. We see some of the darkened, would have been some of the tire rubber in the hardened ground.
State's Exhibit 21.
That would be the rock with the blood stain on the rock that would have been in the vicinity away from, not directly in the apparent struggle area where the club was.
State's Exhibit 23.
Again, a fairly large blood-stained area. This would have been likely in the actual struggle area, the same area where the club
Okay, so the second struggle area, I suppose.
Yes.
That's what we want to call it.
Okay.
All right. State's Exhibit 24.
It appears to be another blood-stained area, and I'm not sure I can relate exactly the location of where that one would have been, since there were several others.
State's Exhibit 25.
25 is showing the victim's body laying on his side. Jeans and briefs were down lower along the legs, and then over to the right-hand side of the photograph, you can see some of the dead fine cuttings that are in the diagram located there.
State's Exhibit 26.
It's another image of the victim's body as it was when we were at the crime scene.
Did you note when you were there, or can you note now on the picture, any mud or dirt on the body?
Yes, the body was soiled in different areas of the body, and was clear decomposition as well.
State's Exhibit 27, and there's over the course of the years, this is just something that's happened to the photograph along with this. So, do you know anything on State's Exhibit 27 here or on the back of his head? That would
Right. There is soil and debris generally in the hair and on other locations of the body in the back. It was also somewhat unusual in that the clothing being low on the victim and was apparently damaged, that there was damage to the clothing, extensive.
State's Exhibit 28.
Again, it's the victim's body, and you can see in relation now to where the pine cuttings are. One of the blood stains would have been to the left corner in the photograph of the victim.
29.
Stage 29 is another view, frontal view of the victim's body.
And State's Exhibit 30.
It's a fairly close-up image showing, some of the decomposition artifacts, some of the maggot activity and flies, as well as soil, on the lower portion of the victim's back.
In the lower right-hand corner, in the right middle of his back, what does that appear to be?
That appears to be soil, the same coloration as the soil from the roadway.
So when you examined this crime scene, how many areas of struggle did you find?
You could argue potentially 3 areas, 2 different areas of drag marks, and then the area in Venture where the shirt or sweater was located, where there was also bloodstains. So potentially, or maybe 2 areas of struggle, another area where some type of activity took place because there was also a bloodstain. Whether there was a struggle there or not, it clearly was related to the crime overall.
Would you describe this as a pretty violent scene?
Yes.
And after examining the drag marks, the victim's body, could you determine that if the victim was drugged?
I couldn't say that definitively. That's certainly a possibility.
Okay.
The evidence would support that possibility.
Okay. Now, you can have a seat. Was this crime scene in Spalding County?
Yes.
I think you have been made aware as you were preparing for trial, that most of the evidence that you collected is gone?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. We previously shown defense counsel, this would be State's Exhibit, I'm marking it 33. Kind of heavy, if you want to walk right to the bottom. Just do it. I'm going to show you what has been marked as State's Exhibit 33, and I'll ask you if you recognize it.
It contains the crime laboratory case number and markings associated with the Timothy Coggins case.
Okay. You did collect a rock and a casting of a rock. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And does that appear to be what you collected?
It does.
Your Honor, at this time I will tender State's Exhibit 33.
It's admitted.
You need gloves. My apologies.
Extra large.
Explain to the jury what casting is.
A plaster cast simply is you could use plaster of Paris, so we actually have, better plaster than plaster of Paris, but if you think of that, you just mix it with some water to kind of a pancake mixture, and it's for taking impressions or castings of impressions, usually in soil. Usually when we're doing plaster casting, we're casting shoe and tire impressions. As in this case, there was a plaster cast I took of tire impressions. But because there was an apparent recent removal of a rock based on the shape of the depression in the ground, I thought it pertinent to maybe relate, where it appeared to be maybe a rock that was not in its normal location back to one where maybe originally was. I'd take to have a cast taken of that hole so I could relate it to the rock and see if in fact that rock was originally in that hole.
And were you able to do that here?
I did.
And were you able to determine if this rock was formerly in this hole?
The rock was definitely in that hole.
Now, how far from the hole was the rock located?
Based on my drawing, it appears to be about 53 feet.
So 53 feet away. All right. And there was blood located on this rock, correct?
Yes.
Could it be, where was the rock located as far as orienting the jury on the map here?
The rock would have been, looking for his number, the rock would have been not in this area of struggle. The rock would have been off to the side, mark number 5 on his diagram over here. Where I had marked, there was apparent drag markings in the area of the rock and the hole.
You marked them and they're marked on Agent Robertson's as well?
Yes, his number 7 are just drag marks that he shows.
So could it be possible that this rock was dislodged from this hole when a body was being dragged behind a vehicle?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Overruled. I can't say that could not have happened.
So it's possible?
It's possible.
Okay, and would the evidence support that possibility?
Yes.
This is quite heavy. How much would you estimate that weighed?
Maybe 15 pounds.
You can stay down here. Turner, I'm marking State's Exhibit 34 for identification purposes. Defense counsel has previously come to the district attorney's office to review evidence, so they have reviewed it. And I believe that you noted, and I'm sorry, we need to note for the record that the case, you recognize the case number.
Yes, the last one, case number.
And there were jeans and underwear collected from the scene.
Likely would have been collected from the autopsy.
These appear to be the jeans and the underwear from the scene.
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I will tender State's Exhibit 34.
Yes, Your Honor.
It's admitted.
Permission to publish.
You may.
There was also a sheet that was placed on the body.
Correct. As crime scene work, we began using clean white sheets so that when the victim's body was transported, any potential physical evidence that may have been on the body just wouldn't fall off and get lost. It would be contained within the sheet. It would also help prevent contamination outside coming onto the victim's body until a recovery was done during the autopsy.
And that's also contained within State's Exhibit 34.
It is.
So this would have covered the victim's body. So this blood would have come from the victim?
Yes. Including with the gloves?
Just with the gloves, yes. Now, you're familiar with the term trace evidence.
Yes, I am.
Can you explain to the jury what trace evidence means?
Generally, trace evidence would be things that would generally require a microscopic type analysis, things like fibers, hairs, paint, glass, soil, where generally micro techniques, if not a microscope, would be used to do its analysis.
Okay. And do you have in front of you the list of evidence that you brought back to the crime lab for analysis back in 1983?
I do.
Will you just let the jury know what was collected and taken back to the GBI for testing?
There would have been the rock, as we've seen. The plaster cast was actually submitted at a later time. There was several blood stains from several of the different struggle areas that we've seen depicted. So an actual soil or collection of leaf material that had actual apparent blood staining on it were submitted. There was a soil sample for a potential comparison if a vehicle were to be found, where a soil comparison could be performed between the soil from, say, Minter Road back to maybe any soil on the vehicle. There were the blue threads were collected and brought back for comparison. The shirt, which I've also described as potentially a sweater, was collected. The apparent club, the broken pieces of the club, was collected, brought back to the laboratory. There were also some cartridge casings from Minter Road brought back.
Was any examination done on those?
No, not that I'm aware of. There was also an empty Jack Daniels bottle also brought back to the laboratory.
Okay, and the cartridge casings, was it ever, in the course of the investigation and analyzing the evidence, did anything come up that the victim was shot?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, he was stabbed.
There was apparent stab wounds.
Okay. The results on the evidence that you found, specifically the fibers, if we can start with the fibers, where were those fibers? And I told you could sit down, but I'll try to bring it up here. Those fibers, where were they located?
They were located in the same struggle area where the club was recovered.
Okay. And did those fibers, blue fibers, match to anything?
Yes, all of those yarns were consistent with the victim's own jeans, the fabric of the jeans.
So the victim's jeans, the fabric from the victim's jeans was in the struggle area.
Correct.
What can you tell the jury about that?
Well, it would appear that since they were yarns, not just fibers, that there had to have been some type of damage to the jeans for those yarns to have broken loose.
Is it easier to make a determination with more than one fiber?
Yes.
Okay, and why is that?
Well, it's less likely that it could just be random contamination or something there not related to the actual incident.
Okay, can you explain to the jury what you mean by contamination? What do you mean by that with hairs and fibers?
Well, contamination would be something that was either already present, not related to the incident, or something that was added to it later, either through transport, in the laboratory, or, somehow some other evidence was introduced into it that wasn't originally there.
And is that common specifically with hairs and fibers?
It is potentially common. Usually the difficulty is at a scene where a lot of fibers and hair may be found. Let's say if the crime scene occurs, let's say in a restaurant where a lot of people would normally be present, you would expect to find hairs and fibers, or dust, if you will, present in an environment like that. But in an open field where you have a blood stain and some apparent drag marks and a broken club, it would seem that these threads would have to be relevant to that particular crime scene.
Okay. Let's move on to the hairs on the club. There were hairs recovered on the club. Yes,
I recovered some negroid head hairs from cracked or broken areas in the club.
And why do you use that word?
These are anthropological terms that are used. Anthropologists generally break down racial characteristics as Mongoloid, Negroid, or Caucasoid, or Caucasian. The current thinking anthropologists these days are kind of moving away from those terms. Instead of Negroid, they would say African ancestry. or European ancestry for Caucasian, or like East Asian for Mongoloid.
So those hairs were located on the club.
Correct.
And then were there any other hairs at the scene?
There were hairs subsequently collected from in the laboratory. Processing I did in the laboratory of the shirt or sweater, that there were several Negroid head hairs there and one brown Caucasian head hair.
Now, what do you make of that brown Caucasian head hair?
It was from a Caucasian person with brown hair.
Okay.
I had no additional notes about the hair other than that.
And if you could just explain to the jury if it's possible that that could be from contamination.
I would say, well, not contamination in the laboratory, not contamination in the collection and movement of it. So if it was contamination, it would have been prior to its collection.
Okay, and how does that happen?
Well, in terms of the collection?
No, in terms of how might a hair be...
Oh,
yes.
Well, clearly the Caucasian hair would not have been Timothy Coggin's hair. So it could have been there from an assailant, could have been there as what we call secondary transfer. So it could have been hair on the assailant's person that then transferred, or it could have been from a location where Timothy Coggins was and picked up a hair from a location prior to the incident. So there would be no definitive way of saying, you know, how the transfer would have happened. Just the more struggle that there is, the less likelihood you're going to retain transferred material on you. So if you had a hair loose on you and there was a very large struggle, the odds would tend to be that the hair would be lost in that struggle, but maybe not.
Okay. And what about the gray Caucasian head hair? Where was that found?
So there was, I did processing of the white sheet along with the briefs and the jeans. And from that collection, there was Negroid head hairs also, as well as one gray Caucasian head hair.
And does the same principle apply to that?
It does.
Okay. And you don't know if an assailant you don't know anything about these assailants. That's not your job.
Correct.
Okay. And you also don't know where Timothy Coggins had been earlier that day and who he had come in contact with.
That's correct.
So you can't, unlike the threads, you really can't say anything definitively about these head hairs.
If a reference sample had been submitted to the laboratory for comparison, I would have had a lot more extensive notes about the hair and the characteristics of the comparison. So without a submission for a comparison, you know, it was just noting that it was there.
Okay. When did the lab start opening up DNA analysis for law enforcement?
In 1990.
When did it become widely used? Is it fair to say that it took a few years before it became widely used?
My recollection was that it became used in casework beginning in 1990, and I recall that there was some trepidation that maybe the DNA unit would be overwhelmed with samples that they didn't have the personnel to cover, so I think they were trying to be somewhat restrictive on cases where they actually used the DNA technology, and I don't recall what any of those restrictions may have been. I just know there was a great concern about overwhelming them with DNA samples at the time.
But back in 1983, DNA was not available.
To my recollection, DNA was not used even by the FBI until I think it was 1989.
Okay, so it was not around, not available.
It was not.
It wasn't an issue with a backup at the lab. It was just not an option.
It was not available at the GBI lab until 1990.
Okay. I don't have anything else. Thank you.
Nick Ross.
Key question. Mr. Peterson, you stated that there were several areas of struggle in this case. Is that correct?
Correct.
In this crime scene. During a struggle, if you and I, for example, were fighting, is it likely that you could be injured?
Yes.
Is it as likely that I could be injured?
Correct.
So when you were going around these areas of struggle and looking at these blood samples, were you collecting those because they could have been the victim's blood, and they possibly could have been an assailant's blood?
Correct.
Let's go back to the hairs. You said that from the time you got on the scene and started collection to the time you collected those off of the piece of evidence, that there wouldn't be any contamination in that time frame.
I believe that's my opinion, yes, that something outside, once the collection took place, the great precautions are taken to collect, preserve, and then also the analysis in the lab to prevent contamination.
And you said that in an open field area like there was in this crime scene, it would be less likely to have hair like this courtroom, or hair fibers that just kind of all over the place. Is that correct?
That'd be correct.
Let me ask you this. You've done quite a bit of analysis of crime scenes. In a case where there's a violent struggle with a knife, with a bladed weapon, have you run into situations in the past where the assailant hurt themselves?
Yes.
In stabbing the other person?
Yes.
And have you run into cases where subsequently that assailant transferred their own blood into the crime scene, either on the victim or somewhere into the crime scene?
Yes.
Now, you said that the plaster cast of the tire impression, that the reason y'all took that was in hopes that at some point you might be able to compare that to a suspect vehicle. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it would be inherent in that you need to keep the tire impression so that when you came up with a suspect vehicle, you could compare. Is that correct?
That'd be correct.
You also said that you would have had a lot more notes and things in your report about these hairs had you had a comparison, a suspect hair syndrome. Is that correct?
Correct.
And again, in order to do that, in order to make the comparison, those hairs would have had to have been kept.
Correct.
You'd have to have them, and then they'd have to send you in a sample to compare it to. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you said that, you told us that blood that you were collecting could have been the victim, could have been an assailant.
Correct. Now, some of the stains that were very large, my assumption would have been it would have been the victim's blood.
Of course. Yes.
But without 100% knowledge, then it's safer to take a collection.
Yes. And you said the hairs could be contamination sometime before collection, but also could have been an assailant hair. Could have been somebody who either committed the crime or a hair from the person who committed the crime transferred on to Mr. Goggins. Is that correct?
Let me just clarify the term contamination. I think what we're really referring to is secondary transfer. Contamination would have been something out of control. Let's say the evidence was not sealed, and in transport to the laboratory, something entered. That would be, I would consider contamination. I believe we're referring to like a secondary transfer. There's no way to know absolutely that the hair was from the assailant. So a secondary transfer could have been from a person to the assailant, to the victim, or the victim from a location that still remains on the victim's body.
For example, just an example, I might have one of my wife's head hairs on my suit.
Yes.
And then I might walk up and somehow that falls off onto the ground or onto the floor or transfers onto your suit.
Right.
That would be kind of what you're talking about, secondary transfer.
Correct.
Okay. But also those hairs could have come from the actual person hurting Mr. Goggins. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the only way to know that would be to try to compare the unknown hairs to some known sample. Is that correct?
Well, that wouldn't tell you if it was a secondary transfer. It could tell you if possibly it's from that person.
From that person.
Correct.
And you said that DNA started being used in 1990. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So that was about 7 years after this case. Is that correct?
Yes.
So it's possible that this evidence could have been put forward for DNA testing during that time frame.
It's possible, but I'm certain that the laboratory policy was that only current cases were going to be typed because of the fear of being overwhelmed with analyses that there were not sufficient staff to test.
You have this list of evidence that was taken up to the crime lab, do you not?
Yes, sir.
Is it the full 4-page report that includes some of the results and things?
Yes.
Okay. If I could get you to take a look at page 2 of that report, there is an item 19. Was there a dollar bill brought in or brought in as part of the evidence at a later date?
The report does reflect that, yes.
Okay. And that dollar bill, according to this, has some reddish-brown stains on it. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if I could get you to turn to the next page, page 3. According to this, that dollar bill was tested and it was positive for human blood. Is that correct? Where it says examination of stains on dollar bill on page 3.
Yes.
Now, when Ms. Broder held up the jeans in this case, I recall you made a note that one of the pockets was turned out on the jeans. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I was across the room. It looked like when Ms. Broder held them up, one of the pockets was still turned out.
That could have happened at autopsy. I don't have a direct recollection of the pocket being out at the scene.
Okay.
It's possible that could have happened at the autopsy in an effort to discover the identity of the victim.
Is it also possible it could have been at the scene and you did not know it?
Yeah, I don't recall.
Yes, sir. Since you are kind of an expert in crime scenes and evidence preservation, I just wanted to ask you, later on in this case, a search warrant was done and some evidence was recovered from a well. And the process of this was something called hydrovacking.
Yeah, I'm going to object. We have a witness coming in to specifically talk about that.
I don't see why this witness, who's an expert in crime scene, cannot testify about how this evidence was recovered and whether that would affect whether we could test it for.
My objection is it would be outside of the scope of this witness's knowledge, and I'm just letting the court know we have a witness this morning that will be speaking on that particular topic.
He has him across. I'll allow him to go into
Let me just ask you this way, instead of going into the specific process, if I were to take evidence and spray it with high-powered water, would that cause issues with being able to find any type of hairs, fibers, DNA, those types of things?
Well, I would say as a generality that handling the evidence that way could certainly remove evidence.
That's all the question I have.
Any redirect?
Just very briefly, on your diagram, do you have it up there? You make some notes about the time that you arrived.
Yes.
And what time did you arrive at the scene?
I have it marked as arriving at 10:50 p.m.
10:50 p.m.?
Correct.
Okay. So anything that would have occurred between the time when the sheriff's office responded that morning till 10:50 p.m., you don't know what happened at that crime scene?
Correct.
Okay. So you don't know what happened with the body or happened with evidence. All that you can testify to is what happened when you got there at 10:50 p.m.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Just one last question, Mr. Peterson. If that hair had been preserved and been compared to a suspect hair, could you, if they matched, make a match?
Yeah, well, an association microscopically would say this person is included as a potential source of the hair. In current technology, there was potential for nuclear or mitochondrial DNA in current technology.
All right. You may come down. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short break. If you would report to the jury room, please.
Coroner, may he be excused to continue to enjoy his retirement?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
We'll just wait for the jury to clear. Y'all be seated, please. Let me take a moment and address the press pool. I know the great need for press coverage on this case, and I respect it. And I'm very thankful for the moderation everybody's being used. But during this break, I'm going to ask all of those that are enjoying still photography to check your cameras. There was a bit of a rush during this last witness over to the corner of the jurors, and the jurors were distracted. So I'm going to ask that there not be any rush towards the jury box during any presentation of evidence. Please try to maintain your positions as best as possible. Also, during this break, please check your cameras because we require silent shutters, and somebody doesn't have a silent shutter. I could hear it, and the jurors could hear it, and I think more than one juror was a little distracted by some shutter sound. So during this break, please check your shutters, and let's watch and not have a rush towards any evidence during presentations. We'll take a 5-minute recess.